If you are not going to have received grace in vain, then you must respond appropriately to grace. Let me tell you something. Maybe this will help us to put this in a very practical context. I hope I can do this, and then we will just pray. I thought I could go into giving you great grace input. Grace input. If somebody is trying to say, so how do I navigate grace? How do I, like somebody say, increase our faith. Evermore, Lord, increase our faith. If somebody is trying to say, evermore, Lord, increase my grace. If you are the retreat, those 5 points that I mentioned, all right, they will be your answer. In fact, the traditional way that those things are called by the church historically is they are seen as means of grace. They are seen as means of grace. The study of the word, prayer, fellowship, koinonia with believers. I talked about what? The ordinances. The major ordinances of the church are what? The Holy Communion and water baptism. And then the 5th thing, obedience. Yes, so if you are asking, how can I have more grace? Those 5 things, you can't fail. So, now that I've put that out of the way, when this man says, I labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I, but the grace of God which was with me. What does it mean? When you look at the life of Paul, you are going to see practically how this played out. So, Paul did things that, ordinarily speaking, were not doable by an ordinary person. All right? Now, let me tell you what it is. So, when grace comes into the life of a person, part of what happens when you start to put grace to work is that you start to labor. And when you start to labor, you will be doing things that if grace was not available to you, you will not be able to do. All right? But if you do not do those things, you will not do those things. When you set out, so it means you have to set out to do the thing. And when you set out to do the thing, you would realize that somehow there is enablement that is made available to you to be able to do it. That enablement is not going to function while putting your energy and your natural abilities or your natural faculties in sleep mode. Are you with me? It is, my grace is sufficient for you. For my what? Strength is made perfect in your weakness. So it is God that supplies you strength. But it is the faculties of your being that expresses that energy that God gives. And usually, when you come to the end of yourself, you would realize that you are still able to go. So you now know that at this point, you are living on supply. That this is not me. If it were for me, I reach my elastic limit. Right? I reached my elastic limit 4 years ago. What you see now is not me. When Jesus went into the wilderness and fasted 40 days, 40 nights, and in those days he did eat nothing. The Bible says afterward, when they were ended, he afterward hungered. This is how grace works. Grace, we weren't told that Jesus Christ was commanded to fast. But when Jesus Christ started to fast, he realized that he could fast. Because you may not feel differently in your body to say, wow, I feel grace, so let's go do it. No. You are going to feel tired, but you will not be broken. Are you with me? Because grace does not function in the absence of your faculties. Your feet is going to trek. And when it treks, it's going to hurt. But the point will be that your feet will be able to trek longer than they are able to trek. You will labor, and grace will be the one that has labored. But the labor of grace will be expressed through your labor. Grace is not the one that is going to stand as a person and will be going to all those places. But it is the grace of God inside you that enabled you to outperform yourself. That you did a lot more than you are ordinarily capable of doing, yet you did. Because there was an unseen power, there was an unseen ability that was available to you. When you do not exploit that ability, you will not know the riches of its possibilities. That's what Paul was talking about. So you many times need to stretch yourself in order to see that there is reserve. I was going to read a passage. I don't know if I still have any more time to read it. You can read it in Acts of the Apostles chapter 14. When Paul was harassed in one of the cities that they went into. You remember the story? All right? Paul had been harassed as the... I don't know whether that was in Iconium or something. All right? Lystra. It was at Lystra. Okay? Yes, it was at Lystra that the people almost came and worshipped Paul from verse 8 of Acts of the Apostles, chapter 14. And they said, the gods are come down to us in the likeness of men. And they called Barnabas Jupiter and Paul Mercurius because he was the chief speaker. Okay? Now, the Bible says, after they were able to deflect it, okay? Verse 19. And there came thither certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium who persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead. This was in Lystra, where Paul was about to be worshipped as God. They were about to build a shrine, because they said the gods are come to us in the likeness of men. And Paul had to try hard to prove to them that he was a human being just like them. Aye, how times have changed. Today, people are trying hard to prove to us that they are not human beings like us. Paul was the one saying, you see, we are human beings like you. Now, the same Paul in the same city, the same men that were just about to worship Paul, some other people came from Antioch and convinced the men that were a short while ago going to worship Paul, and those same men turned against Paul. All right? And they stoned him, and then they drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead. That means that they stoned Paul until they thought he had died, and that the only reason they stopped stoning him was because they now thought he had died. That was when they stopped, supposing he had been dead. So having stoned Paul, they drew him out of the city. You see, the language of draw him out of the city makes my body to cringe. They didn't take him out of the city. How did they get him out of the city? They drew him out of the city. That's to draw something. Okay, to drag. Do you get the language? They finished stoning Paul. When they stoned him and they thought he had died, they now held one of the leg or held one of the hand. I said, we don't want any cadaver in our city. So they dragged him out of the city. Because as far as they were concerned, this man had died. The next verse now says, howbeit, that's like nevertheless, as the disciples stood round about him, he rose up and came into the city. And the next, what? Day. Not year. The next day, he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. And when they had preached the gospel to that city. Excuse me. If what happened to Paul happened to you today, what will you be doing tomorrow? The next day, not the next week, not the next month, not the next quarter, the next day. This is a man that yesterday people thought he had died from stoning, not typhoid, stoning. So the man was healthy. They stoned him and stoned him and stoned him and stoned him until This adult thought that the man had died. And then they dragged him out of their city. So when they left, the disciples now came from the city and went to where Paul was. And that's a matter for another day. But they stood round about him. And then he rose up. God revived his life. He rose up and went into the city with them. Then the next day, I'm trying to talk to you about the grace. This is grace that labors. This thing here, this is grace that labors. This is not normal. A man cannot be stoned today and be traveling the next day to another city to preach the gospel. It's not normal. Not just that they stoned him, it was not, they were not experimenting. They meant it. And the Bible says, supposing him to be dead. That means they were convinced that they had killed him. That was why and how they stopped stoning him. How can you the next day be going to another city to say the same things that you said that made them stone you yesterday? So how do you think Paul looked like when they were going to Derbe the next day? If you were stoned yesterday, it wasn't that he rose with an immortal body. No. Do you know what his face looked like? Do you know how swollen the man was? Do you know how much bandage he had on his body from stoning? They stoned him yesterday. And then he was in Derbe the next day to preach the gospel. He didn't go to recover. What grace is this? Or tell me, if this is not grace, what is it? He goes there, and I can imagine people asking him, what is this? What happened to you? They stoned me. Oh, what did you steal? He said, I didn't steal anything. What did you do? Well, what I came to tell you was what I told them. That was why they stoned you? Yes. And you are still saying the same thing? Yes. For we cannot but say the things that we have seen and heard. So if it is the temptations of the holiday that you are going to think are too terrible for grace to handle, I'm trying to show you grace. I'm showing you grace in the context of human life and existence. When this man said, none of these things moved me, it was not because he was too powerful. He knew a secret. My grace is sufficient for you, and my strength is made perfect in weakness. So the man said, therefore I would rather glory in my weaknesses, so that the grace of God might find expression and be glorified in me. People of God, I like to say to you that you will never be able to exhaust the supply of grace that is available to you in the course of the passage of your life on the face of the earth, because it is out of his fullness. Your entire fullness cannot take his fullness. Everything you are meant to do, you are called to do. The space that you have and the need you will ever have will never be able to exhaust the supply that is available. Out of his fullness have we all received. Every one of us has an allocation. Every one of us can receive. All of us can receive out of his fullness. And what we receive is grace on top of grace. So when I come today to receive grace, I can say, sir, I came to receive grace so that I can qualify for grace tomorrow. It's grace for grace. Can you talk to him? Grace. Grace for grace. In the next 2 minutes, I'd like you to appropriate grace. I am not helpless. No, I am not exposed. No, I am not defenseless. No, I will labor because of grace. It is precisely because of grace that I will labor. Grace is because of grace that I will live the way I live. It is because of grace that I will labor the way I labor. Grace to live, grace to labor, all because of grace to be. There's a grace to be. That's where we start. Then there's a grace to live.